All right, we're starting recording. Is that a good volume for you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So, welcome everyone to the first part of my religious studies lecture series. It's on Enochian magic. And so we're going to try to steer clear of basically any theology, but we're still going to intermingle with it a little bit. We're mainly going to be focusing on the historical, anthropologic foundations and the religious texts themselves. And so we're going to be looking at Enochian magic through the lens of the political context of the time, the historicity behind Enochian magic, and if it has any foundation. So, for those of you that aren't versed in what Enochian magic is, basically we have a system of magic that was developed during the late, and the system of magic has to do with theurgy, which is basically, as opposed to goeity, where goeity is demon summoning, theurgy is angels summoning. So, Enochian magic, before we dive into Enochian magic, we first have to look at the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is basically about a biblical patriarch who was 5 generations removed from Adam. So he was like Adam's great grandson, but he was the great grandfather of Noah. And in the Book of Enoch, basically what happens to Enoch is this huge angel war breaks out because the angels look at the daughters of men, quote unquote, and they think they're beautiful. And so they go and they rape the daughters of men and they create this giant race of beings called the Nephilim. Some people think it's ancient aliens. Some people think there were actual giants, whatever. You're looking at biblical history at this point. You're not really looking at historicity. What we do have historically with Enochian is or the Book of Enoch was referenced by biblical scholars and by rabbinic scholars up until the 1950s, when our first complete version of the Book of Enoch emerged in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Before that, we had only seen it written about. We'd only seen Enoch written about and referenced by theologians. We didn't have any kind of text coming from Enoch. It was the 1950s and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that gave us our first complete text of the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch is an apocryphal text in basically all Jewish and Christian religions or sects, except for the Coptic Christians and the Ethiopian Christians. So the Coptic Christians would be the Egyptians, who are much more magically inclined, and then the Ethiopian Christians, who are very much more Old Testament than New Testament, as you see with like different sects of Christianity. So that's where we get the name Enoch and his association with the angels. In the Book of Enoch, it is rumored that Enoch lived until the age of 389, and he was the only person to enter heaven still alive. So God basically kidnapped him after this huge angel war and said, guess what? Like, you're going to come to heaven with me. So Enoch is a very important patriarch in Jewish and Christian circles, but people don't give weight to the Book of Enoch. So now that we have that foundation laid out about like who Enoch was and like what his relationship was to the angels, we're going to go into Enochian magic. Now, at the time that Enochian magic was developed, we did not have a complete text for the Book of Enoch, and nobody could agree on who Enoch was or what he did. You know, like this was all references of references of references that theologians were battling each other about. And so at the time that the Enochian magic was developed, we still hadn't seen a clear religious tale of exactly what happened with Enoch. All we knew was that he was the first and probably only person that was brought to heaven by God while still alive. So there are two major key players in Enochian magic. There's John Dee and there's Edward Kelly. Enochian magic was transmitted to Dr. John Dee through his seer, his alchemist, Edward Kelly. Now we have to look into the character of John Dee and Edward Kelly. So John Dee was a very famous Renaissance man during the time that he lived, that once he got involved with Enochian magic and developed Enochian magic, he got shoved to the back of the history books. But this was a Renaissance man, true and true. This was a cartographer, a mathematician, a political spy, a court astrologer, and towards the end of his very academic career, he found that academia couldn't give him the answers that he was looking for, and that's why he started getting into magic and scrying and alchemy and looking towards kind of a spiritual lens to kind of give him the answers that he was seeking. Then we have Edward Kelly, who is basically the complete opposite. Edward Kelly is not a respected person. He's a rumored and known necromancer. He has stolen shit out of Christian bishops' tombs. And all he's seeking is fame and money. And these guys, they meet each other, and because they're so opposite, they realize that they have this really good partnership going on. So whereas John Dee has all the academics backing him, and he has arguably the largest library in Europe at the time, and he is during his lifetime, he was the Renaissance man of Europe. Edward Kelly is a ruffian, a scoundrel, a criminal, a black magician. He does necromancy. He steals stuff out of tombs. He's chasing fame. He's chasing money. And so Edward Kelly seeks John Dee out at his estate in Lake Mort in England, because John Dee is known for, at this time, having the largest library. And Edward Kelly says, if this guy can't give me the Philosopher's Stone, if he can't teach me how to transmute any base metal into gold, then nobody will be able to, because this is like the foremost authority in academia. This is a Renaissance man. So he shows up at John Dee's door, and John Dee is working with a different scryer at the time, and he's not getting much results out of him. And so in one session, Edward Kelly showcases his scrying techniques to John Dee, and they are so successful and so amazing that John Dee fires the scryer, and he decides to start a partnership with Edward Kelly, because Edward Kelly knows how to talk to spirits. So this time period that John Dee and Edward Kelly worked within were between the years of 1581 and 1589. John Dee continued the Enochian system up until I think it was 91. He kept continuing the system, but without Edward Kelly. So basically what would happen in these sessions was John Dee would sit down and he'd have Edward Kelly scry into a black crystal ball, and he'd have him relate whatever these entities Edward Kelly was talking to him, and he'd write them down. Partners split in 1589, and the angels, or the entities that they were giving them instruction, gave strict instruction not to use Goetti. So there's a few different theories behind what these entities are, and we'll approach those later. But basically, the angels informed John Dee and Edward Kelly that they were part of a divine plan. And this divine plan was divided into 3 systems, but there's 2 major systems that are practiced today. The third system is not, it's lost to time. Nobody knows where it is. But the angels informed Dee and Kelly that they were a part of a huge divine plan. And so the way that these systems were communicated to Dee and Kelly were in bits and pieces. They were completely backwards. And because John Dee was such a beautiful mind, like he was a mathematician, whatever Kelly would spout out of the crystal ball, John Dee would be able to organize and jot down and develop into something that you could read. And so the first half of what we know of Enochian magic was worked out by Dee before his death. And this is the half of Enochian magic that you see in Golden Dawn, or people who follow Aleister Crowley, or people who follow any kind of like Western esoteric tradition that's kind of a combination of like Egyptian and Enochian and tarot. Like that's the first half. That's what Dee figured out before he died. The rest was figured out by different translators who discovered his works after these systems had already been established. So the second half was worked out and published by a guy named Merritt Casaubon in 1659. So this was maybe 30 years after John Dee's death. He took upon him Dee's works and he preserved them in the British Library. And this is where the Golden Dawn took most of their Enochian reference from, because before then, we hadn't seen the first half of Dee's work. It was hidden away. The second half that was published and transcribed by Casaubon is the half that contains the 4 watchtowers, the Enochian keys and calls, and the vocabulary of the Enochian language. So you can learn how to speak the Enochian language through the second half, which is the oldest version that Merritt Casaubon translated. And that's the version that made its way into the Golden Dawn. The first half, though, was the Heptarchia Mystica, and that has been unavailable to all magical systems because it wasn't discovered until maybe 100 to 200 years after John Dee's death, and it was already after these secret societies had established, had filled in the blanks for Enochian magic using their own Hermeticism and Egyptology. Both systems, it depends on the magician that you're asking, but both systems are either considered separate, or there's a very popular belief, especially by historians, theologians, and religious studies majors, that both systems need to be in complete unison in order to be whole. Like, you cannot perform Enochian magic without having both systems in play at the same time. So I already established that Golden Dawn Enochian is not the original is not the original Enochian magic, and that it deals with a modified version. So basically, sorry, I'm going through my notes right now. Okay, so the gates and keys, which is the system of Enochian magic that the Golden Dawn Society, Aleister Crowley, and Anton LaVey were concerned with. Basically, its only concern is in the ritual summoning and commanding of angels and lesser spirits. They're all evocations. It's not an invocation. Like, you can't invoke these entities. Like, you have to evoke them. These calls and keys are kind of like if you can imagine a lock on a door. Within the 4 watchtowers, the 4 watchtowers protect 49 gates to 49 different cities. And so through your evocation, you're unlocking these gates to these different angelic cities in a spiritual place that give these angels permission to come back into the world and perform whatever you want them to perform. There are 49 gates though, but one is too holy to be open. So the keys listed in Casaubon's Calls and Keys only number 48. So I'm sorry, does anybody have any questions? Nope.
What exactly are, like, I've heard people say that they might be like fallen angels instead of actual angels, right? Like, what do you have to, what's your views on that angle?
Well, okay. We're gonna actually get into the nature of the Enochian angels a little later. So
Hold my horses.
That's a very, very good question though.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the best questions about Enochian magic. Okay, so I'll address that a little later in the lecture.
Okay. Real quick question. Okay, so John D was, I don't know. He probably wasn't oblivious to what this guy was doing. Edward
What
Kelly
guy?
was doing.
Well, okay. Well,
because Edward Kelly seeked
discussing-
him out, right?
No,
And
this
he
is
wanted
really
the
good.
Philosopher's Stone, basically, from...
Yes. So it was a completely symbiotic relationship. So John Dee was like, I'll help you find the Philosopher's Stone if we can find it through these scrying sessions, but you have to help me like contact the other side. Like you have to help me in my spiritual pursuits or whatever. And this was what created the symbiotic relationship between John Dee and Edward Kelly. Like they were very much, until the day that John Dee died, John Dee considered Edward Kelly one of his closest friends, even though they were completely opposite people. John Dee was a well-respected academic Renaissance man, and Edward Kelly was a ruffian, fame-seeking, criminal necromancer. Yeah, he was, but they ended up being the closest of friends and the best of friends because they had the symbiotic relationship. So,
well, obviously, if they put this together, but okay. So, and then real quick, what was the other what was the time period you had? It was 1581 to 1589. They continued scrying, but John Dee continued scrying after Edward Kelly. What, he died, or he left, or he was fired?
After Kelly died, John Dee continued scrying with a different assistant, but none of the stuff that came out of those scrying sessions was of any value. So, like, if we're putting into political context when this was happening, why this was happening, so basically John Dee was he was a court astrologer. This was right when Protestantism was getting its rise. England had just established its new church, and so who John Dee was to the English government, the British government, when Bloody Mary was in reign, John Dee went to Queen Victoria, who Bloody Mary had locked up, basically put her under a house arrest in her own little mansion. And she requested John Dee, because John Dee was a very known astrologer at the time. She was like, can you cast the charts between me and Bloody Mary? And he cast the charts for pretty much perfectly. For Bloody Mary, the exact year Bloody Mary was going to fall, and the exact year Queen Victoria was going to take the throne. This really pissed off Bloody Mary, and so she had John Dee locked up and tried for this crime. But before his trial could come to end, Queen Victoria had already taken the throne. So Queen Victoria had an affinity for John Dee, and they both considered themselves close friends because they both got locked up for the same reason. It was the casting of those astrological charts. And so John Dee was given explicit permission by Queen Victoria and her court. He was not only her court astrologer, he was also her political spy, and he was also given explicit permission, like, the government is not going to fuck with you if you're conducting magical experiments. We're going to let you do that. You go ahead and do that, because Queen Victoria had a thing for John Dee, and John Dee, like, they had this magical bond together. So that's why John Dee was able to get away with a lot of the shit that he was doing at this time. But if we're going to continue there, we're going to move into the third part of Enochian magic, which is the Book of Silver Leaves. And the Book of Silver Leaves is a spirit book. And so practicing Christian occultists during this time, they would have spirit books, and it's basically your own personal grimoire. Well, the Book of Silver Leaves was John Dee's spirit book. And the Book of Silver Leaves is supposedly the key to unlocking both parts of the Enochian system, but it has never been gifted to anybody. Historians doubt that it was ever gifted to John Dee, because there is a popular theory that the angels gave him the entire system, and all they were waiting for was to give him the Book of Silver Leaves, which would contain all the sigils and all the prayers to unify both parts of the Enochian system and really summon these entities. And so there is a popular theory upon, like, in Enochian practitioners, that the Book of Silver Leaves is kind of the unifying factor, and you can't conduct true Enochian magic unless you scry your own Book of Silver Leaves. And the reason it's called the Book of Silver Leaves is because it's a book, and you're supposed to paint on the edges of it in silver. But the two parts of the Enochian system that we have, other than the Book of Silver Leaves, the adept occultist technically could be able to scry and build their own Book of Silver Leaves. The two working parts that we have are the keys and the 49 keys and calls in the Book of the 30 Aethers. Book of the 30 Aethers was the one that was founded later, or it's represented by the last 30 keys. So you can call the Book of the 30 Aethers by calling the 19th Prince. Well, we're going to move back into the history and not dive so much into the practice of it, because I'm not a practitioner, I'm just a history nerd.
Sorry,
so
one quick question.
Go ahead.
So what are the three main practices again? Because you said that the Golden Dawn was missing one chunk. So could you just review that again quickly for me?
Yes, please.
There are three parts of Enochian magic. The first part is what Golden Dawn use. Those are the 49 gates and keys. And those are the ritual summoning and command of angels and lesser spirits. Then you have, after that, you have the Mystica Heptarctica, which has to do with the planetary angels, which are numbered by and numbered by the days of the week. That is the part of Enochian magic that is missing from most modern occultism, because at the time that Enochian magic was developed, the societies that were working with Enochian magic were missing the Mystica Heptarctica. And then you have the Book of Silver Leaves, which is basically the sigils that connect the 49 keys and gates to the Mystica Heptarctica. Nobody has that. So, in theory, the adept occultist could scry and get their own Book of Silver Leaves, which, the sigils aren't necessarily going to present themselves the same way that they presented themselves to John Dee, if John Dee ever got the Book of Silver Leaves. But that's that's the third part of it. And so that's leads into an interesting question about these entities, and we're going to get into that. So like I said, D was seeking angelic magic to serve his nation. D was very driven by his role to the Queen, to England. He wanted, during this political turmoil that was going on in Europe, we had the Inquisition happening in Spain and Italy. Everybody else was experiencing Protestantism. This was a very unstable time for Europe. And Dee was very much a patriot. He loved his queen, he loved his country, and he wanted this knowledge to be able to command Europe and the world geographically in order to be able to command nations. Whereas Kelly, he just wants to be famous, he wants to make a shit ton of money, and he wants to turn base metals into gold. That's all he wanted. Trying to figure out what I can skip through. So Dee was he knew Latin, he knew Greek, he knew Hebrew. He's a mathematician, a philosopher, an astronomer, an astrologer, historian, an author, a cartographer, and a navigator. So this is a very, very intelligent man. Edward Kelly, he ran into red powder on his travels before he met Dee. And when he found this red powder, he stole it from a bishop's tomb in France, practicing necromancy. And this is where he gets his very, very famous criminal reputation from. It's because he conducted necromancy, and then he robbed a tomb of a bishop, and he found red powder. Now, when it comes to alchemy, during this day and age, you had to have a combination of the red powder and the white powder in order to conduct alchemy, in order to turn base metals into gold. And so after Kelly found this red powder, he was convinced if he went and met John Dee, he'd be able to get John Dee, or through his experiments, be able to get the secret to getting the white powder. And then all of a sudden, Kelly would finally be the alchemist that could turn base metals into gold. Dee's original scryer before Kelly turned up was this guy named Barnabas Saul, and he basically misled Kelly, or not Kelly, Dee, and he misled him. He stole a bunch of money from him, and so when Kelly shows up and he can actually scry and Barnabas can't scry, that's when the partnership begins. So, all right. Hold on.
Wait. What regarding the 49 gates? You said something about like a gate that was too holy to open. What do you mean by that?
Yes, there's only instruction for 48 gates in Enochian literature. The angels commanded specifically that there was one gate too holy to open, that they'd never be able to open themselves, and so they never gave them any information on opening that gate. So now we're going to get into the nature of the angels and the nature of the scrying sessions. Now, these angels were extremely... Kelly believed himself that they were demons, and towards the end of their scrying sessions, Kelly believed that they shouldn't be communicating with these entities at all. Dee was kind of led, or maybe he had such a large ego, he basically thought he was a new prophet of Christ, and he did some really fucking stupid shit, traveling around Europe and pretending that he was a new prophet. But Kelly believed these things weren't angels at all, that they were actually demons, and Kelly was the one that was in communication with them. Dee took on this kind of higher notion that they were like prophets and that he was about to save the world or whatever. So Dee, being a political spy, was a highly paranoid person, and he lived at this place he lived at his own manor in England called Mortlake, and people would seek out because he was an academic and an extremely intelligent guy, people would seek out his guidance, very rich, famous people, because he was involved with the aristocracy and the hierarchy of European society. And so Count Albert Lasky of Poland, he ends up visiting Dee during these scrying sessions, seeking his guidance on some political turmoil or whatever. And the angels start telling Dee during these scrying sessions that there is a political agenda against him, and that if he doesn't leave with Count Albert Lasky to Poland with his entire family, if they don't pack up their bags and move out to Poland as Count Albert leaves, that he's going to get arrested. He's going to get imprisoned and possibly tortured and killed because of the magical practices that he's doing. And so Dee's an extremely paranoid person because he's a spy, and he has to be. And so Dee packs all his bags up and he moves his family out to Poland with the Count as the Count leaves, and Kelly follows suit because Dee is Kelly's employer. That's where Kelly's making his money at this time. So they get out there, and what happens to Mortlake is a bunch of peasants, a bunch of village people. It wasn't the government. They end up going up to Dee's house. They burn it down, and a few of the people that were burning it down recognized Dee's literature as grimoires, literature, whatever. They recognized it as really important. So a few people ran off with some of the stuff that was burning in the pile, and that's mostly what we have of Dee's work. We have a few different famous grimoires that came from Dee's library at that. The Liber Lilith is another famous grimoire that was a part of Dee's library that got stolen on that night that they burned his manor down. So the angels, they asked some very extreme stuff of both Dee and Kelly. And now Kelly was not interested in marrying. He was not he was an alchemist. He was a black magic practitioner, and he thought sex was horrible, and he thought marriage was horrible. So he thought that sex and marriage got in the way of his ultimate goals as an alchemist and a magician. But the angel Michael commanded Kelly that he needed to marry a certain woman. And he didn't want to do it, but Dee talked him into doing it. Kelly ended up having a very horrible relationship with his wife Joanna, who was much younger than him. And this was the woman that the angels commanded him to marry. The angels instructed Dee to be a prophet. And so after he went out to Poland and with Count Albert Lasky, he started traveling around Europe, specifically staying away from Spain and Italy because you could get burned for saying the things that Dee was about to tell these people. He was going to Poland, Prague, all over Eastern Europe, and he was basically telling these people, these lords, these princes, these kings, saying, you have to repent for your sins, you're horrible, you're doing everything wrong, and I'm a prophet, and you know, there's nothing you can do about it. Like, you're going to get burned, or your entire empire is going to be destroyed unless you listen to what I'm saying to you, which was really, really ballsy thing to do at this time. In my opinion, he should have been killed, or he would have been killed, but maybe there was something protecting him. Who knows? I don't know how he got through it. But specifically the King of Prague took interest in him, not so much as that he believed in what Dee and Kelly were saying, but he wanted to keep tabs on them. He realized something was up with them. And so he kind of followed them around after he went. And after they went and basically told this guy to go fuck himself, he started following them around Europe with his own private spies. Trying to move on. Okay, so it was in the spring of 1587, towards the end of their scrying sessions, that Kelly requested that Dee and him stop working with the angels and that they return to England. Dee did not want to do it and asked Kelly why, and Kelly explains, one of the angels that they're in contact with, specifically the angel that told Kelly to marry his wife, requested that they start wife swapping. And now these are both Christian men. Okay, so at this time, occultism, what they were doing wouldn't be considered magic or occultism. This would be considered exploring Christianity. So they're both Christian men, and this angel that pressured Kelly into marrying his wife is now telling him to wife swap, and they're both completely distraught. And Dee's wife absolutely hates Kelly, thinks he's a horrible person, but Dee is so full of himself, so convinced that he's a prophet and that he can't doubt these entities, that he convinces them all to wife swap. And they all fuck each other. And then about 2 months later, they stop the wife swapping sessions or scrying. So when you look and you analyze what these angels were asking or what they were telling these guys, they're saying that Jesus was not God. No prayer ought to be made to Jesus. There is no such thing as sin. A man's soul goes from one body to another child's. There is as many men and women now as there always has been. Adam and Eve was not history, but has another meaning. There's no Holy Ghost. And they claim that praying to Jesus takes away honor from God, so you should pray directly to God. And this leads you to a kind of different perspective where you see two men who were brought up in Protestant or post-Catholic Europe or Protestant Europe. You see them being led by whatever entities they're talking to kind of a Gnostic Christianity, which leads to the question, was the wife swapping symbolic of the union between Dee and Kelly as partners? Was it harnessing occult energies? Really, this is where we're going to get
definitely harnessing occult energies.
Yeah, so this is where
that's what their goal was, so it had to have a purpose at that point.
Yeah, so this is where we're going to go into kind of the exploration and the intent of the angels through what they were telling Dee and Kelly. So Dee believed that the angels, like these angels in classical Christian tradition, they don't have free will. So you have to ask yourself, why would these entities be giving John Dee and Edward Kelly this ultimate system of magic? So Dee believed, when he asked himself that question, that the magic system was given to him in exchange for acting as a prophet to the rulers of Europe. And then there are certain historians and scholars that believe that Kelly was completely manipulating Dee for alchemical knowledge or whatever fantasies of fame that he had. Now, the Enochian system, when you this is a personal opinion, but the Enochian system, when you study it, when you study the Enochian language, it is so highly complex. I could not imagine anybody, even a scholar, being able to invent it off the top of their head through scrying sessions. You know, like, it is extremely linguistic. But that's my personal opinion, so disregard that. So Dee regarded his dealings with the angels as a legal contract in exchange for Enochian magic. Dee would carry their teachings and their commandments to the leaders of the world, and Dee considered the wife swap to be a test of faith, similar to when God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son. Every Enochian Sabbath, which lands on Monday, the wife swap happened. The angels, however, when you look at what they were telling Dee and Kelly, they were obviously not concerned with Dee or Kelly's matters. They were not concerned with what they wanted. The angels were interested in planting Enochian magic onto humanity for unknown higher reasons. Well, like, we can't assume what some kind of spiritual higher intelligence, whether it was an angel or a demon or somewhere in between, they didn't care. Like, they had their own agenda. And so at this conclusion, a lot of people who study Enochian magic conclude that the angels were manipulating D and Kelly, and that it wasn't Kelly manipulating D. D believed he was a prophet chosen by God and a spokesman for the angels to the princes of the world. D believed Enochian magic was a reward for his piety. Kelly was, on the other end, Kelly was extremely distrustful of the angels. He believed they were deceitful and using the pair. He believed they were demons in disguise. In all likeliness, the angels probably chose D because he was one of the few men at the time with enough intellect to interpret their ciphers, Kabbalah, and mathematics. So now we have to look at how the system actually works. So when you're working the system in its full system, when you're using all two parts, and then if you have your own book of spirits or book of silver leaves with sigils to link the two systems together, what you're basically doing is you're opening 4 watchtowers, which are represented by the 4 cardinal directions. Each watchtower has 12 gates that lead to 12 angelic cities, which can also be explained as like dimensions of reality. The gates of the watchtowers are opened by the 48 keys and calls. They evoke the angelic hierarchies into our universe through the gates of the watchtowers. And the leaders of each hierarchy named on the squares, which are magic squares of the watchtowers, and their numerous followers have specific functions detailed in D's Liber Sanctea Auxilia et Victoria Terrestris. Basically, through the Enochian system, they view the universe of time that human consciousness exists in as a bubble that's maintained by these 4 watchtowers. So these 4 watchtowers basically hold these bubbles together, and by doing the different calls, you can pop each end of the bubble until the outer universe, the outer spiritual universe explodes into the inner universe. The 4 ruling angels who are part of the towers sustain the bubble's cohesion, and opening the gates of the watchtowers is to admit both holy angels and the Enochian fallen angels who sinned with the daughters of men into our world. So the angels preach that the earth goddess, and this is detailed through the scrying sessions that were happening with Kelly. The angels preach that the earth goddess is supposed to be punished for harboring humans who are sinful. They say that they want into this world and that they're mad at Earth, specifically a goddess, for offering sustenance to humans. This is basically what D was running around and telling the princes of Europe, and for some reason they didn't kill him or burn him at the stake. So D thought the apocalypse would happen preordained time by God's will, but the Enochian angels stated that the apocalypse will begin with the opening of the watchtowers and the gates. It can only be opened from the inside by humankind. So the angels, because they're timeless beings, they can't open the watchtowers themselves, but they can kind of control when it's going to happen by presenting the Enochian system to humans, and then all they have to do is introduce the Book of Silver Leaves to the right adept magician to open those watchtowers. So that way they have a little more control over like when the apocalypse happens and when they have to go do their business. Enochian magic, by a lot of scholars, is basically a tool that will enable humankind to open up the gates of the apocalypse. The angels, they can trigger the apocalypse and open the gates because it requires the evocation. And evocation and invocation are matters of free will. So that's something that angels lack. They don't have free will. So they have to present an entity with free will the option to open up these gates. D was never granted, at least in his writings, he was never granted permission by the angels to perform the evocation during his lifetime. And the entire evocation it's a very short ritual. It should only last a week. But D was, as far as we can tell in his writings, was never granted permission by the angels to perform the evocation during his lifetime because we don't have any records of that. And so after all this shit happened, Dee died in 1608. Edward Kelly split up after the whole wife swapping incident and went back to Prague and worked for the Emperor of Prague as an alchemist. And he was doing really well. He was really famous, and he was making a lot of money and working in the king's court for maybe 3 or 4 years. And then he, for some reason, was locked up in a tower by the king of Prague. And Kelly died trying to escape his prison in Prague. He fell out of a tower that he was locked in. Dee died later after Kelly in 1608. And what was left of his library was sold to a guy named Robert Cotton. So what Robert Cotton has is what the Enochian system is based off of. So after Robert Cotton, his son basically transcribed and preserved all of Dee's writings that he had access to in the British Library. And that's when Samuel Mathers, who was one of the 3 founders of the Golden Dawn, that's when he was doing his research in the British Library, and he stumbled across Dee's writings, and that's when they kind of implemented that half of the Enochian system into their magical traditions, whatever. There were a few different texts that were buried in the earth by John Dee's son Arthur, who was also a magician. He was a black magician and aspiring alchemist, but he was basically a failure, and he was running around basically like, I'm John Dee's son. Kept trying to collect his father's writings, and he couldn't collect too much of it, but what he did collect, he buried in a chest under the ground that was dug up a few years later after his death. The second half of the system that the Golden Dawn did not have access to actually has a really interesting story. Basically, during that first burning of Mortlake, a chest got stolen, and somehow it ended up in a shop down in London. And the wife of a warden from the Tower of London bought him this chest. And so the chest sat in their attic, and they stored things in it. Moving it around one day, they ended up finding a hidden compartment in the chest, which detailed the very first scrying sessions from 1581 up to 1583. That was what the planetary and weekly angels, that was the missing half of the system. That's where it was found. It was in some hidden woman's chest. So basically what we know of Enochian magic in modern magical practitioner has been distilled from the Golden Dawn. Then Aleister Crowley famously, when he was with his assistant going through, I think it was Morocco, going through the desert when he famously fucked his assistant, he was invoking and calling, or evoking and calling, all 48 spirits of the Golden Dawn version. That was before he ran into that entity that gave him what we know as the Book of the Law. And so the Golden Dawn, basically how they filled in the missing parts was they assigned colors, signs of the zodiac, directions, the tetragrammaton, and other famous occult elements to the system where they were trying to fill in the blanks. And then after Aleister Crowley, it got watered down to Anton LaVey. And as we know, Anton LaVey wasn't very much a practicing occultist, but a lot of what we know of Enochian magic now was developed by Anton LaVey. He employed a very edited version of the keys that Crowley employed, which was an edited version of the Golden Dawn, which was an edited version of Dee's original work. Yeah, so I'd like to finish this with 2 readings from, you guys know me, I'm not a big fan of Revelations, but we're going to end this with 2 readings from Revelations. And I saw, this is Revelations 4:5. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written with and without, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof?" And no man was able, neither in heaven nor on earth, nor under the earth, to open the book nor to look on it. And I wept much, because no man was found worthy to open the book nor to see it. And one of the ancients said to me, "Weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof." And I saw, and behold, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 living creatures, in the midst of the ancients, a lamb standing as it were slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into the earth. And one more reading. This is Revelations 1:16. And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, "Go and pour out the 7 vials of the wrath of God upon the earth." And the first went and poured his vial upon the earth, and there fell a sore and grievous wound upon men who had the character of the beast, and upon them that adored the image thereof. And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and there came blood as it were of a dead man, and every living soul died. And the third poured out his vial upon the rivers and the fountains of waters, and there was made blood. And I heard the angel of the waters saying, "Thou art just, O Lord, who art and who wast, the Holy One, because thou hast judged these things." Any questions?
The whole thing about the apocalypse, wouldn't you have to be, from what I'm getting at this, wouldn't you have to be kind of a jackass to practice Enochian magic? Because you're essentially letting in entities that want to punish the earth. You know what I mean?
That's
don't like us.
That's the big debate within. I'm not an Enochian practitioner at all, so I couldn't give you I couldn't tell how they fit you, but I can definitely tell from the evidence that we have, they definitely don't seem to be on our side.
Well, isn't the apocalypse like the biblical apocalypse? It's the unveiling of whatever.
Well, it depends. Yeah, it depends on how you like. Some people are excited for the apocalypse.
That's how Crowley looks.
Have you guys ever heard of the term accelerationist? It's like these people that will they'll do a false flag on their own country. They'll kill their own citizens to cause a war because they want to get the war over with, because they want to win. Well, I'm saying it's the same. It's the same concept that if you want to start a holy war between the spiritual worlds to get somewhere, then you might be an accelerationist by performing Enochian magic.
That's a good point.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
because since I've been studying Kabbalah recently, these don't sound like the Kabbalistic Old Testament angels that we're used to and that people have been kind of practicing with for the Renaissance and more than. You know what I mean?
What I've been told is that the next stage of evolution requires 10 out of 11 people dying.
Where are you getting this information from?
Scrying.
Enochian angels.
I don't know for sure. That's just what I've been told.
So you scrying them like a Black Mirror or Black Crystal Ball and use the magical squares?
Magical squares.
Showers.
Yeah, I play Magical Foursquare.